The question itself contains an embedded assumption that almost never survives contact with the life that follows. The question is not actually about money. The question is about the present conditions of a specific employment situation that has become intolerable, and the belief that a large enough number creates an exit from those conditions. That belief is partially correct. But it conflates two different problems: the financial problem of sustaining a life without employment income, and the structural problem of building a life that remains purposeful without the architecture that employment provides. Work, at its least interesting, still answers the question of what you are doing on a Thursday afternoon. It provides a calendar, a set of obligations, a social network, an identity legible to others, and, critically, a structure that organizes time in a way that the human brain appears to require. Research published by behavioral economists at Harvard Business School and the London School of Economics studying early retirement transitions consistently finds that the cohort with the most financial preparation experiences the highest rates of what researchers call structural identity collapse in the first 2 years after exit. Not the people who ran out of money. The people who had enough money and discovered that enough money does not build a Thursday afternoon. Those who exit at 35 and do not return, not because the money forced them back, but by choice, share a pattern that the financial media has little interest in covering because it does not convert to subscribers. They left towards something rather than away from something. Before the exit, they had already built, outside of employment, a set of activities that were intrinsically motivated, community-connected, and capable of absorbing time at a level of engagement that the job had previously occupied. The financial exit was not the organizing event. It was the last step in a sequence where the life had already been constructed and tested. The money removed the last remaining constraint. It did not build the structure it was expected to enter. The person most likely to succeed after quitting at 35 is not the person most eager to quit. This is the uncomfortable observation that sits underneath the entire genre of early retirement content, unspoken, because it makes the product, the aspiration, harder to sell. What to do with this? The binary between quit at 35 and work until 65 is a false one, and accepting it as the only available frame is how people end up staying too long in situations that are genuinely damaging them because the full independence number feels permanently out of reach. Semi-retirement is not a compromise. For most people under 40 with serious accumulated assets, it is a structurally superior configuration. A person with $800,000 in investable assets who generates $25,000 to $30,000 annually through part-time work, consulting, or a small creative income stream needs to withdraw only $30,000 to $35,000 from the portfolio to sustain $60,000 in annual expenses. At $35,000 withdrawn from $800,000, the withdrawal rate is 4.4%, aggressive by the standards of a pure early retirement, but manageable when the part-time income acts as a buffer during market downturns. The sequence of returns risk drops substantially. Healthcare coverage may partially arrive through a part-time employer or a lower-income ACA subsidy bracket. The portfolio's 50-year survivability improves without requiring another decade of full employment. $800,000 is a number that many more people can reach by 35 than $2 million. It is a plannable, achievable milestone for someone earning above median income who began aggressive saving at 25 with discipline and without catastrophic interruption. It is not easy. But it is real. The strategic question worth asking is not, how much do I need to quit at 35? The strategic question is, what is the minimum financial base that allows me to leave employment that is damaging me, while retaining the ability to work on terms I define, at a pace I control? That number is lower than full financial independence. It is almost always higher than what most people have accumulated when the urgency to leave is at its most acute. Every variable accounted for, compound growth curves sweeping upward with geometric certainty, inflation adjustments color-coded in amber, Monte Carlo simulations run at 1,000 iterations. It took him 3 months to build. He quit his job on a Tuesday, 44 days later, at 35 years and 7 months old, with exactly the number the spreadsheet said he needed. Not $1 more. Not one assumption revised. By October of the following year, the market had corrected 31%. His projections did not survive the correction, not because the math was wrong, but because the math had never accounted for the order in which things happen. The spreadsheet assumed growth. Markets deliver growth in installments, and the installments arrive in no particular sequence that favors someone who just stopped earning an income and started withdrawing from a portfolio that is simultaneously shrinking. He went back to work 18 months later. A smaller title. A different company. He never spoke about the spreadsheet publicly. Not everyone who exits at 35 ends this way. Some survive the bad years. Some thrive across decades. The difference between those two outcomes is not always a larger portfolio. Frequently, it is a different question, asked earlier, with more precision, and answered without the contamination of optimism. The financial media has made a business model out of telling people that early retirement is closer than they think. This is the counterargument. Not because early retirement is impossible, but because the distance between what the popular answer says you need and what the honest answer requires is large enough to swallow someone whole. Pause. The standard response to the question, "How much do I need to quit at 35?" originates from a single academic paper published in 1998 by 3 finance professors at Trinity University in San Antonio, Texas. Their research was titled "Retirement Savings: Choosing a Withdrawal Rate That Is Sustainable." Most people who have never read it know it as the 4% rule: withdraw 4% of your portfolio annually, adjust for inflation, and the money has a statistically high probability of lasting 30 years. 30 years. The study was designed for retirees at 65 with portfolios that needed to survive until 95. The researchers were rigorous, the methodology was sound, and the conclusion was appropriate for the question they were actually investigating. At 35, however, the math requires not 30 years but 50. Possibly 60, depending on health and genetic inheritance. The Trinity researchers never ran those projections because a 50-year retirement horizon was not their question. The 4% rule was extracted from its original context by a generation that encountered it on Reddit and in YouTube thumbnails, applied wholesale to a problem it was not designed to address, and elevated into something approaching received truth, without anyone pausing to ask whether the original study had any relevance to a person quitting before the Reagan administration's tax cuts had finished compounding. It does not. Not cleanly. The relationship between withdrawal rate and retirement horizon is not linear, it compounds in the wrong direction. A portfolio sustaining 30 years of withdrawals at 4% has roughly an 87% survival rate across historical market sequences, according to the original Trinity data. Extend that horizon to 50 years, and the survival rate at 4% drops to somewhere between 68 and 74%, depending on whose research you are reading and which historical windows they tested. Those are not retirement odds. Those are casino odds, acceptable at a blackjack table, not acceptable as the arithmetic foundation of the next 50 years of your life. Most serious financial planners working with early retirement clients use 3.25% to 3.5% as the functional ceiling for a 50-year withdrawal horizon. The numerical gap between 4% and 3.5% sounds academic. The financial gap is not. On a $1 million portfolio, the difference is $5,000 less in annual withdrawable income. More consequentially, to generate $30,000 per year at a 3.5% withdrawal rate, the required portfolio is not $750,000. It is $857,000. To generate $60,000 annually, a modest, not comfortable income in any major metropolitan area, the required portfolio at 3.5% is $1,714,000. The popular figure circulating in FIRE communities for a $60,000 lifestyle is $1.5 million. The honest figure is closer to 1.7. That gap, $200,000, is not a rounding error. It is 4 to 6 additional years of aggressive saving for most high-income earners. It is the difference between the portfolio that the spreadsheet says is enough and the portfolio that the historical record says survives. Then there is the variable that nearly every early retirement calculator treats as manageable, when it is, in fact, the single largest undercounted expense in any 35-year-old's exit plan. Healthcare. The mechanism is not complicated, only expensive. Medicare eligibility begins at 65. A person exiting employment at 35 faces 30 years of individual health insurance coverage before a single day of Medicare applies. In 2024, a healthy 35-year-old purchasing individual coverage on the Affordable Care Act marketplace paid between $800 and $1,400 per month before subsidies, depending on the state and the plan tier chosen. That range represents $9,600 to $16,800 per year, a cost that does not remain stable, because healthcare inflation has outpaced general inflation for 30 consecutive years without meaningful interruption. The Congressional Budget Office, Kaiser Family Foundation, and actuarial data from major insurers consistently show healthcare costs growing at roughly 5 to 7% annually in real terms, even during periods when general inflation was below 2%. Compounding 5% annual healthcare inflation over 30 years transforms an $800 monthly premium into a monthly premium north of $3,000 in current dollars by the time Medicare arrives. The total lifetime healthcare expenditure for a single person exiting employment at 35, budgeted with actual historical inflation rates rather than optimistic flatline projections, sits between $400,000 and $600,000. That figure does not appear in most early retirement calculations. It appears in the rude awakening that arrives around age 45, when the premium renewal notice lands and the original budget collapses. This is before the tax code delivers its own orientation session. Traditional retirement accounts, 401k, traditional IRA, are structured around a timeline that assumes employment until 60. Early withdrawals before age 59.5 incur a 10% penalty on top of ordinary income tax rates. On a $30,000 withdrawal from a traditional account, a person in the 22% federal bracket pays $6,600 in income tax plus $3,000 in early withdrawal penalty, an effective rate of 32% on money they saved to be free. There are workarounds. The Roth conversion ladder requires 5-year lead time on each converted amount and demands the planning discipline to execute correctly over a decade. 72T SEP distributions allow penalty-free access but lock the withdrawal schedule for the greater of 5 years or until age 59.5, eliminating financial flexibility. Both methods require assets held in taxable brokerage accounts as a bridge while the workaround matures, which means building, effectively, two portfolios in parallel. The system was not engineered to be hostile toward early retirees. It was engineered to reward the person who waits. The penalties, the age thresholds, the Medicare gap, they are not obstacles inserted by malicious bureaucrats. They are the structural consequence of an institutional framework built around a life sequence that looks like: work until 65, collect Social Security at 67, use Medicare from 65. Everything in the architecture rewards waiting. Penalties accumulate against whoever decides to leave early, silently, in the fine print of forms that most people sign without reading during orientation week at a job they were grateful to get. Pause. Sequence of returns risk is the variable that ends more early retirement plans than market crashes, inflation, or spending discipline failures combined, and it is the least discussed element of the early retirement conversation precisely because it cannot be solved, only managed. The mechanism is mathematically precise and practically devastating. Consider two people who retire at 35 with identical $1 million portfolios, identical 7% average annual returns across 30 years, identical withdrawal needs of $40,000 per year. Person A retires in a year when markets rise 18% in the first 3 years. Person B retires in 2000 and watches 30% of their portfolio disappear before their third anniversary of freedom. At the end of 30 years, both portfolios recorded the same average annual return. The ending balances are not the same. Person B's portfolio is depleted, not because the market performed worse on average, but because early losses compound backward through withdrawals. Each $40,000 distribution in a down year takes a larger percentage of an already smaller base, leaving less capital available to participate in the recovery when it eventually arrives. This is not hypothetical. The cohort of people who retired between 1999 and 2001 on 4% withdrawal assumptions from equity-heavy portfolios learned this sequence problem with money they did not have a career left to replace. Those who had structured their plans around 4% of $1 million found themselves in 2003 withdrawing against a portfolio worth somewhere between $500,000 and $700,000, depending on allocation. The sequence had already decided their outcome. The average return, measured eventually, had not. Managing sequence risk requires structural solutions, not psychological ones. A cash or short-term bond buffer equivalent to 2 to 4 years of living expenses, held outside the equity portfolio, allows withdrawals to continue during market downturns without forcing the sale of equities at depressed prices. The equity portfolio is left undisturbed to recover. The buffer is replenished when markets recover. Research from financial planner Michael Kitzes and asset management firm Vanguard both support the buffer approach as a meaningful reducer of sequence of returns damage in long retirement horizons. The buffer requires additional capital, roughly $120,000 for a $60,000 annual expense base, assuming a 2-year buffer. It is not included in the headline number most people calculate. It is not optional. The honest all-in calculation, then, for a single person sustaining $60,000 in annual expenses over a 50-year horizon from age 35. Portfolio required at 3.5% withdrawal, $1,714,000. Cash buffer, $120,000. Healthcare reserve, a separate, conservatively invested fund specifically earmarked for premiums and out-of-pocket costs, distinct from the main portfolio, $150,000 to $200,000, depending on current health status and risk tolerance for healthcare surprises. The honest total is approaching $2 million before the main portfolio is even fully accounted for. For a couple with $90,000 in annual expenses, the figure sits closer to $3 million when all components are included with accuracy. Most people who feel trapped in their jobs at 35 do not have $3 million. Most people who feel trapped at 35 are asking the wrong question. Here is what the number cannot solve. The gap between the urgent feeling and the actual target, that is where the worst decisions get made. People stay too long because the full independence figure feels permanently distant. Or people leave too soon because the urgency wins before the preparation is complete. Both errors are expensive. One costs years. The other costs the portfolio that was supposed to sustain the freedom. The framework that tends to hold across the widest range of situations, calculate the full independence number honestly, at 3.5% withdrawal, with complete healthcare accounting, with a cash buffer, and with a healthcare reserve that reflects historical inflation rates, not optimistic projections. Then calculate the semi-retirement number separately, the portfolio size at which modest additional income makes up the withdrawal gap. Work toward the second number first. Use the years between reaching the second number and the first to build the life that needs to be waiting on the other side of the financial exit. By the time the full number arrives, you will already know whether you actually need it. The Florentine merchants of the 15th century had a concept they called la pace, the peace. Not leisure. Not idleness. Not retirement in any sense the word now carries. Peace, the condition of holding enough reserves that the next contract, the next transaction, the next obligation could be declined without catastrophe. They did not stop working. They reached a threshold at which work became voluntary, and voluntary work bore no resemblance, in texture or in meaning, to compelled work. The same merchant who had bargained desperately at 28 bargained from a position of complete indifference at 42, because the answer to "what happens if this deal fails" had changed from ruin to inconvenience. The freedom was not in stopping. It was in the change of position. The number you are looking for is real. It is calculable. It is almost certainly larger than the figure that circulates in early retirement communities, and almost certainly more complex than any single headline can contain. And it is almost certainly smaller than the cost, measured in years, in health, in the slow arithmetic of staying too long, of waiting until you have no choice but to leave.